Shabbat Shalom. I have a question. If the early bird gets the worm, how can it be that good things come to those who wait? I'll ask the question again. If the early bird gets the worm, how can it be that good things come to those who wait? I think there's something interesting about human nature. When it would be good for us to rush into action, we take our time. When it would be good for us to wait and think a little bit, we rush into action. And I think too, in our world, especially since the advent of social media and the cell phone, we are rushing more and more into decisions and opinions when we would actually benefit from stopping and taking our time to think things through. In our Torah portion this week, Parashat Tisa, we see exactly this state of human nature. When it's very clear that Moses will come down after 40 days on Mount Sinai with the tablets and be able to instruct our ancestors in righteous living. It seems to be there was a miscalculation of timing, however, and our ancestors got tired of waiting for Moses. Perhaps they just misjudged when and how to count, or perhaps they just had a lack of faith built into them. And it actually says in the Torah that when Moses took a little too long in coming down from the mountain, that's when our ancestors rushed into the sin of the golden calf. Here they were just redeemed from Egypt by God. And just a few months later, they're already rushing in to create an idol because they couldn't patiently wait just a little bit longer for Moses to return. Why is it that the early bird gets the worm, but good things come to those who wait? How do we know when to rush into a decision? And how do we know when to hold back and wait on rendering an opinion or a judgment? This past week, we saw an incredible response to the anti-Semitism that has plagued campus since October 7th. When Mahmoud Khalil, one of the leaders of, at minimum, the pro-Palestinian movement, if not the pro-Hamas movement, was arrested on Columbia. And $400 million are being withheld from Columbia because of their inability to keep Jewish students safe and being able to access their classes. How do we as Jews feel about what happened in this last week? And I wanted to take some time with you this morning to just share with you some of what I'm thinking. I want to invite you at lunch to share with me what you're thinking. Because what I saw over the last week was Jews rushing to express their opinions and to take a stand on the right or wrong of this arrest of Mahmoud Khalil and of holding back the $400 million. And I know this is going to surprise you when I say this, but as I watched how people, and especially leaders of Jewish organizations, took a stand on the rightness or wrongness, you could probably do a pretty good job of guessing for whom they voted in November. Because that's where we're at these days, right? We rush to our side. We rush to support our team, whether it's right or it's wrong. We know how terrible it's been for Jews on college campuses since October 7th. And if there's anything that we learn from the Purim story, it's that we Jews are not seeking special treatment. We're seeking simply to be able to live in safety and in peace. And when we have the opportunity to defend ourselves, then we should avail ourselves of that opportunity. Because if there are any lessons that we've learned, not only from the Purim story, but from October 7th, it's that when our enemies say they desire our destruction, guess what? They're telling the truth. We should take them at their word and believe them. And so we have an obligation to stand up for ourselves when we can. We must stand up to protect ourselves. And it's pretty incredible that in this case, the government actually stood up in protection of the Jewish people. That, I think, is one of the lessons that comes out of Purim, and one of the factors that we should weigh in our response to the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil and the withholding of $400 million from Colombia. We cannot tolerate those who seek our destruction. America ought not to tolerate those who seek the destruction of any group. This is intolerable. And speaking of tolerance, one of the philosophical things upon which I've been reflecting since October 7th is what's called the paradox of tolerance. Are you familiar with this idea, the paradox of tolerance? The paradox of tolerance says, in our desire to be tolerant, because that's what good human beings ought to be, we ought to be tolerant, we sometimes begin to tolerate those who are intolerant toward others. And the longer we tolerate those who are intolerant, the more intolerance takes over. That's the paradox of tolerance. The more we tolerate intolerance, the more intolerance takes over. And I think especially among the pro-Palestinian and certainly the pro-Hamas community, which are not necessarily identical, and we should be very careful about conflating the two. We have been very tolerant of the intolerant. And it's led certainly to an uncomfortable and most probably to an unsafe environment for Jewish kids on the college campus, and maybe for Jews everywhere throughout the United States. So as we think about the arrest on Columbia's campus of Mahmoud Khalil and the withholding of $400 million because of Columbia's inability to counter anti-Semitism, we should remember the lessons of Purim and of October 7th, that we have to protect ourselves. And we should remember this paradox of tolerance, that if we become too tolerant of the intolerant, intolerance takes over. At the same time, we know that we Jews have benefited in this country from the First Amendment and from due process of law. And we know that whenever something comes up to begin to pull those rights into question, inevitably, it will be the Jews who suffer for it. And so I think it's fair to wonder down the road if Mahmoud Khalil might be first in the arrests. Will it eventually be the Jews who suffer as the First Amendment begins to be quashed and due process called into question? I see a look of confusion, right? Historically speaking, whenever a government becomes more and more right-wing, who's typically in line for those who they want to silence? For those whom they want to deny rights? It's the Jews. And we have to be aware of that history. And I think there's something to be said, too, that the pursuit of justice is best achieved in daylight. If those who claim to be pursuing justice do so without following due process, by making people disappear and denying them access to attorneys, we have to begin to wonder how just those actions actually are. And so there's something to be said for thinking about the role of law and due process and what it means in this particular situation and what it means on the slippery slope of history and how it's going to affect the Jewish people. I'm not sure where I stand on the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil. I'm not sure where exactly I stand on the withholding of $400 million from Colombia. Because, of course, you know there are Jewish professors, there are Jewish patients who are going to be affected by the withholding of that $400 million? I'm just not sure. I'm grateful for the opportunity to protect ourselves. I'm grateful that the government and others are saying that anti-Semitism can no longer be tolerated on college campuses. And I worry about the slippery slope. In full disclosure, I worry about what that means for the Jews one day. And so I was thinking about all this as some of my colleagues and lots of us were rushing to render an opinion on the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil and the withholding of $400 million seconds, if not hours, after it happened. And I wanted to bring to light not only the sin of the golden calf in this week's Torah portion, but the response, God's response to the sin of the golden calf. And of course, God realizes that we Jews are rushed to not always make the best decisions. Human nature is to rush and not always think things through. So I'd like to invite your attention, if you want to join me, I'm in the Eitz Chaim on page 527. Exodus chapter 31, page 527. And of course, what is God's response to our rush into the sin of the golden calf? It's to command us with regard to the building of the Mishkan, that portable sanctuary in the wilderness. God says these Jews can't handle the notion of an invisible God, and therefore let them at least build a sanctuary in which to come to serve the invisible God. And so here I am on verse 6 of chapter 31. And you'll see in the English, God says, I've also granted skill to all who are skillful, that they may make everything that I've commanded you. That's with regard to the building of the tabernacle. But the Hebrew is interesting. You see, it says, Ubelev kol chacham lev, natati chokhmah. A more direct translation of, I have also granted skill to all who are skillful, would be better read, Ubelev kol chokhmeh lev, and into the heart of all of those who are wise of heart, natati chokhmah, I've given wisdom. Now that's a whole lot of redundancy that doesn't make entirely a lot of sense. So a couple hundred years ago, the Vilna Gaon came to explicate this verse for us. And what the Vilna Gaon comes to teach is that we humans tend to think we're very smart. But our smarts are often based on our emotion and our intuition. That's the Chacham Lev, that's the wisdom of the heart. And sometimes we benefit from that emotion and that intuition. But most of the time, we would do better seeking real and lasting truth. And so therefore, God says, Ubelev kol chacham lev, and into the heart, Vilna Gaon teaches, into the heart of all those who act and think on emotion and intuition, natati chokhmah, I've given true wisdom. I've given the desire for truth. And only then can we really build a nation of justice and compassion. Only then can we seek to do what is good and what is right in the eyes of the eternal. We live in a complex world. We Jews have an obligation to protect ourselves. And we have an obligation to be grateful to all those who stand up to participate in our simple desire to live in peace and security. And we Jews also have an obligation to pursue justice, to do what is good and what is right in the eyes of the eternal. And so this Shabbat of Parashat Tisa, as we watch what's going on in the world around us, I pray that God should grant to all of us who are Chachmei Lev, who are wise of heart, Chokhmah, the true and lasting wisdom that comes from truth, that comes from desiring to do what is good and what is right in the eyes of the eternal. Adonai Ozi Amo Yitain, Adonai Yivarech et Amo V'Shalom. May God grant us the strength to seek truth and to pursue wisdom. And please God, may we all be blessed with peace. And let us say together, Amen.